It was a chilly October morning in Chicago. The air was brisk, carrying with it the faint smell of roasted coffee and fallen leaves. Karen Thompson was running late for her flight, her designer boots clicking hurriedly across the marble floor of O'Hare International Airport. She gripped her Louis Vuitton carry-on in one hand and her overpriced latte in the other, already irritated. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control. Her schedule, her appearances, her carefully curated social media posts, but nothing irritated her more than people disrupting her sense of peace. And today, that disruption came in the form of overbooked flights, loud travelers, and far too many delays. Finally reaching her gate, she groaned audibly as the boarding line snaked further than she'd expected. Karen tapped her manicured nails impatiently against her phone screen, occasionally checking Instagram out of habit. Seat 7B, Economy Plus, she reminded herself, relieved she'd upgraded. She hated sitting near too much noise. Once aboard, Karen squeezed down the crowded aisle, tugging her bag behind her and scanning for her seat. As she approached row 7, she froze mid-step, her jaw tightening. There it was, seat 7A. Occupied by a man, but not just any man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and black. That wasn't the issue for her, not entirely. It was the red MAGA hat perched proudly on his head. Karen's pulse quickened as her face flushed with anger. Make America Great Again. Words she associated with division, ignorance, and everything she despised about the current political climate. Of course, she muttered under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. The man glanced up as she hovered near the seat. "Ma'am," he said politely, his deep baritone voice almost gentle, "I think that's your seat next to me." He motioned to 7B. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her latte trembling slightly in her hand. She took in the man's presence, his confident posture, his warm brown eyes that seemed undisturbed by her obvious discomfort. Her eyes darted to the hat again. Bright red, bold letters, MAGA. "No," Karen said flatly, her voice dripping with contempt. "I'm not sitting there." A few passengers nearby turned their heads to glance at the commotion. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "It's a seat," he said calmly. "It's where you're supposed to sit, unless you're waiting for an upgrade." Karen's lips thinned. "I'll wait for the flight attendant." The man let out a quiet, bemused chuckle. "Suit yourself." He adjusted his cap and went back to scrolling through his phone, completely unfazed by her hostility. Karen stepped back into the aisle, fuming. Of all the people on this plane, why did I get stuck with someone like him? She thought bitterly. She flagged down a flight attendant, a young blonde woman with an enthusiastic smile. "Excuse me," Karen said, forcing a polite tone. "I can't sit in 7B. The attendant's smile wavered. "Is there a problem with the seat?" Karen crossed her arms. "There's a problem with the person in it." The attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. She glanced at the man in 7A, who now seemed mildly interested in the exchange, his eyebrow raised once more. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said cautiously, "but the flight is full. We don't have any open seats to move you to." Karen's nostrils flared. "Then I'll get off the flight," she declared. "Ma'am, I'm serious," Karen snapped, her voice rising enough to turn more heads. "I'm not sitting next to someone who—" She stopped short, biting back the rest of her words. There was a pause. For a moment, the attendant looked unsure of how to proceed. The man in 7A, however, finally spoke up. "Lady," he said quietly, his tone firm yet calm, "if you're so offended by my hat, I'll take it off. But this is just a seat. We're both trying to get somewhere." Karen turned to him, startled. "What?" The man sighed and pulled the red hat off his head, setting it down on his knee. "There," he said. "No hat. Will you sit now, or do you still have a problem with me?" Karen stared at him. For some reason, the sight of him without the cap made him look more human. less of a political statement and more like a man. Just a man. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just looked tired. A pang of guilt crept up Karen's spine. Her outburst had drawn attention, but now she was the one who looked ridiculous. Silently, she slid into seat 7B, avoiding eye contact. The flight attendant gave her a strained smile. "Thank you for your cooperation." Karen nodded stiffly, still feeling the heat of embarrassment on her cheeks. As the plane began to fill up, she sat rigidly in her seat, arms folded. Next to her, the man remained quiet. She could feel his presence, strong and calm, like a force field of unshakable resolve. After a few moments, he turned to her. "I'm David, by the way," he said quietly. "David Harris." Karen didn't respond immediately. She just stared at her latte, pretending not to hear. "All right," David muttered, leaning back into his seat. "Suit yourself." For the next hour, Karen sat in silence, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at her. But her mind kept drifting back to his calm response, to the way he'd removed the hat without hesitation, as though proving something about himself. She didn't know it yet, but David Harris was about to change her life forever. The plane ascended into the gray sky, leaving the Chicago skyline shrinking behind. Karen stared out the window, jaw tight, heart still pounding from the earlier confrontation. The hum of the engines and the scattered chatter of passengers did little to soothe her irritation. David Harris, the man sitting next to her, calm as a still lake, seemed unfazed by the awkward tension she created. He wore a gray sweater under his leather jacket, now that the infamous red hat sat on his lap. Occasionally he glanced her way, as if waiting for her to say something. She wouldn't. Karen tapped open her phone, needing a distraction. A barrage of unread messages awaited her. Work emails, Instagram notifications, texts from her friend Jess. "Jess, how's the flight? Hope you're not stuck next to some weirdo." Karen smirked bitterly and typed a reply. "Karen, I'm stuck next to a MAGA guy. Total nightmare," Jess replied instantly. Jess, "OMG, just your luck. Stay strong, queen." Karen let out a quiet breath, but she didn't feel the satisfaction she expected. She slid her phone into the seat pocket in front of her. Next to her, David shifted, pulling out a book. Karen couldn't help but glance at the cover. Man's Search for Meaning, by Viktor Frankl. "Interesting choice," she muttered before she could stop herself. David looked at her, surprised she'd spoken. "You've read it?" "No," Karen admitted, averting her gaze back to the window. "But I've heard of it." "It's good," David said quietly, turning a page. "You might like it." Karen scoffed under her breath. "I doubt that." David raised an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as someone who runs from a challenge." Karen's head whipped toward him. "Excuse me?" He smiled faintly, still looking at his book. "Viktor Frankl writes about finding meaning even in suffering. Challenges make you stronger, but you seem like someone who fights back when things don't go your way." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't know me." "You're right," David said simply. "I don't. I'm just making an observation." Karen huffed, crossing her arms again. How dare this man act like he knew her, sitting there like a therapist, with his stupid hat and calm demeanor. The plane jolted suddenly, rattling the passengers. The seatbelt sign dinged above them, and a flight attendant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Karen gripped the armrest tightly, her breath hitching. She'd never been fond of flying, and turbulence always sent a wave of panic through her. Her stomach dropped as the plane jolted again, harder this time. "You all right?" David's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm fine," Karen said sharply, though her knuckles were white from gripping the armrest. David studied her for a moment. "You don't like flying." "What gave it away?" she snapped, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. David let out a low chuckle. "Here." He extended his hand toward her, palm up. Karen blinked at it, stunned. "What are you doing?" "Sometimes it helps to hold someone's hand during turbulence," David said calmly. "My daughter used to do it all the time when she was younger." Karen stared at him, at the quiet confidence in his expression. His daughter, she hadn't imagined him as a father. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of whether to recoil or accept the offer. Another sharp jolt rocked the plane, and before she knew it, her hand shot out, gripping his. David's hand was large and warm, his grip steady, but not overwhelming. Karen squeezed it tightly, her pride bruised, but her panic slowly ebbing. "You're all right," he said softly, almost like a mantra. "It'll pass." Karen closed her eyes, taking deep breaths. The turbulence eventually faded, leaving the plane cruising smoothly once again. When she finally let go, she mumbled a quiet, "Thanks." David gave a small nod. "No problem." Karen pulled her hand back into her lap, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. What just happened? For the first time, she glanced at him, really looked at him. David's face was worn but kind, the faint lines around his eyes suggesting years of laughter and experience. There was a quiet strength about him that unsettled her. This wasn't a man who yelled or fought to be heard. He was someone who listened. She didn't like it. "Your daughter," Karen blurted out, desperate to change the subject. "You said she used to hold your hand on flights?" David's face softened. "Yeah, Kelsey. She's in college now." Karen tilted her head. "Where?" "Howard University," David said with pride. "She's studying political science." Karen blinked. "Howard? That's impressive." "Yeah, she's smarter than me, that's for sure." David smiled wistfully. Karen hesitated. "So, you're into politics?" David's smile faltered slightly. "You could say that." Karen glanced at the red hat still sitting on his lap. "The hat? You're really one of them?" David met her gaze evenly. "You mean a Trump supporter?" "Yes," Karen said bluntly. David sighed. "I am, but probably not for the reasons you think." Karen's brow furrowed. "What reasons, then?" David paused, as if considering his words carefully. "It's complicated." Karen snorted. "That's what people say when they can't defend their views." David looked at her, unoffended. "Maybe one day I'll explain it to you." "Doubtful," Karen replied coolly. The tension hung in the air again, thick and unyielding. Karen turned back to the window, but something inside her had shifted. She felt off balance, as though she were looking at something she didn't understand. And what bothered her most of all was that, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to understand. The hum of the engines filled the uneasy silence between Karen and David. Outside, the clouds stretched on forever, a blank canvas that matched the emptiness she felt sitting there. For a moment, Karen thought about slipping in her earbuds and shutting him out entirely, but she didn't. The lingering feeling of David's hand, steady, reassuring, still sat with her. It was unnerving. How could someone like him have given her even a moment of peace? She turned toward him, her tone sharp to mask her discomfort. "You said it's complicated, so explain it to me." David looked up from his book, the surprise evident on his face. "Explain what?" "Why someone like you wears that hat," she said, motioning to the bright red cap on his lap, her voice lower now but no less pointed. "You said you're not what I think. So, tell me. I'm listening." David studied her for a long moment, as though gauging whether she was serious or just trying to bait him into an argument. Finally, he sighed and set his book aside. "You sure you want to have this conversation?" Karen crossed her arms, her pride flaring up again. "You said I don't run from challenges, didn't you? Convince me you're not what I think you are." David let out a dry chuckle. "All right, fair enough." He picked up the hat and turned it over in his hands, the bold white letters MAGA facing him. His expression softened, though his voice remained steady. This hat means a lot of things to a lot of people. I get that. For some folks, it's a symbol of everything that's wrong in this country. And I won't pretend I don't understand why people see it that way. But for me, it's not about hate. It's about hope. Karen scoffed, shifting in her seat. Hope? You've got to be kidding me. David didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his eyes calm. I grew up in Detroit, he began. Late 70s? Early 80s? Back then, we didn't have much. My parents worked 2 jobs each just to keep food on the table. Dad worked construction, Mom cleaned houses. They never complained, but I could see it wearing on them. I saw what it did to them when factories started closing down, when opportunities dried up, and when my dad lost his job for the 3rd time, I made a promise to myself. Karen tilted her head slightly. What promise? That I'd do better? That I'd work twice as hard, maybe 3 times as hard, so my kids wouldn't have to see me break the way I saw my dad break? David's voice grew quieter, more reflective. And I did it. I joined the military right out of high school, served 8 years. After that, I used the GI Bill to get an education, started my own trucking business, and worked my way up, built something I'm proud of. Karen blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected this. And what does any of that have to do with that hat? David smiled faintly, almost sadly, because for a long time, politicians would come to towns like mine and make promises they never kept. Republicans, Democrats, it didn't matter. We were forgotten either way. Then one day, someone came along and said things the rest of them were too scared to say. He talked about bringing back jobs, about rebuilding American manufacturing, about people like my dad not being left behind anymore. And you know what? He looked at Karen, his gaze steady. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. Karen swallowed, suddenly unsure of how to respond. David continued, his tone soft but firm. Does that mean I agree with everything he says? Or everything he's done? No. But sometimes, when you come from nothing, you hold on to whatever hope you can get. That hat, for me, is a reminder of where I came from and how far I've made it. It's not about division. It's about my family, my business, and my community. Karen stared at him, her anger momentarily diffused. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, uncertain of what to say. David leaned back in his seat, his voice quieting. You don't have to agree with me. Hell, you don't even have to like me. But don't assume you know my story just because of a hat. Karen sat there, stunned. She had built her entire worldview on assumptions, categorizing people into neat little boxes. A man in a MAGA hat? Bigot, racist, threat. But David didn't fit the box she'd put him in. He was human, complicated, and that unsettled her more than anything. So you're just okay with all of it? Karen blurted out, frustration creeping back into her voice. The things he says, the things he's done? David shook his head. No, like I said, it's complicated. I don't agree with everything. But here's the thing, Karen. If we stop talking to people just because they see the world differently, we'll never get anywhere. I'm willing to listen to you. Are you willing to listen to me? Karen swallowed hard. I don't know, she admitted quietly. David nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. Fair enough. He picked up his book again, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. For the rest of the flight, Karen sat silently, staring at the seat in front of her. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions she didn't want to ask and answers she didn't want to hear. David had cracked open a door she wasn't ready to walk through, but something told her she couldn't close it now, not completely. And that thought terrified her. The plane began its descent into Miami, where Karen's work conference awaited her, and David's plans remained unknown. Karen had spent the last hour pretending to read a magazine, though her eyes lingered on the same page far too long to be convincing. Her thoughts were still tangled with David's words. He wasn't what she'd expected, and that bothered her. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Karen found herself glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. David seemed unbothered, calmly packing his book into his bag. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, Karen stood quickly, anxious to grab her things and get off the plane. But as she tugged at her carry-on from the overhead bin, it stuck. She yanked harder, but the bag wouldn't budge. "Need a hand?" David asked from below, already standing beside her. "No, I've got it," Karen snapped, giving the bag another futile tug. David didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached up, easily freeing the bag with one smooth motion. He handed it to her without a word, his expression unreadable. Karen mumbled a stiff, "Thanks," refusing to meet his gaze. As they shuffled off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Karen fully expected their paths to split. But when she turned to head toward baggage claim, she noticed David walking in the same direction. "Are you following me?" she asked, more sharply than she intended. David chuckled. "Relax. I'm not stalking you. I'm heading to the same exit." Karen didn't respond, but she slowed her pace slightly, falling into step beside him. The carousel was already spinning with luggage when they arrived. Karen spotted her sleek black suitcase almost immediately and stepped forward to grab it. The bag was heavier than she'd remembered, and she struggled to lift it off the moving conveyor. David, again, appeared by her side, effortlessly hoisting the bag and setting it down for her. "I had it," Karen insisted, her tone defensive. "I know," David said simply, giving her a small smile before turning back to retrieve his own luggage. Karen clenched her jaw, irritation simmering beneath the surface. She hated feeling indebted to him, even for small things like this. But more than that, she hated the growing awareness that he wasn't trying to one-up her. He was just kind. The silence stretched as they left the terminal, the humid Miami air hitting them like a wave. Karen pulled out her phone to call for a rideshare. "Heading to a hotel?" David asked casually. Karen glanced at him. "Yeah, work conference." "Nice," David said, nodding. "I'm here for a charity event." She blinked. "Charity?" David chuckled at her surprise. "Why does that shock you so much?" Karen hesitated. "I just didn't expect that." David adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. "It's a foundation I work with, helps veterans transition back into civilian life. Job training, housing, that kind of thing. We're hosting a gala tonight." Karen felt a pang of guilt for her earlier judgments. "That's actually really great." David gave her a small smile. "Thanks, it's something I'm passionate about. A lot of guys I served with didn't have the same opportunities I had when they came back. They deserve better." Karen shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Her rideshare pulled up, breaking the moment. "This is me," she said quickly, gesturing to the car. David nodded. "Safe travels, Karen." Something in his tone, warm and genuine, made her pause. She hesitated before speaking. "You too, and thanks for helping with my bag and all." David smiled. "Any time." She climbed into the car, watching him through the window as the driver pulled away. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the busy terminal before disappearing into the crowd. Karen spent the rest of the afternoon in a blur of meetings and networking events, but her mind kept wandering back to David. His story, his demeanor, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, it all gnawed at her. Later that evening, she returned to her hotel room, exhausted but restless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jess. "Jess, how's Miami? Meet any weirdos yet?" Karen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Karen, actually, yeah. But not the kind I expected." "Jess, oh, spill." Karen didn't reply. Instead, she set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. After a long moment, she sat up abruptly, her thoughts racing. She grabbed her laptop and typed "Veteran Transition Charities Miami" into the search bar. It didn't take long to find it. The Harris Foundation for Veterans Support. His face stared back at her from a photo on the homepage, standing beside a group of smiling volunteers. Karen clicked through the site, reading about the Foundation's mission, its success stories, and the upcoming gala. David had founded the organization almost a decade ago, dedicating himself to helping others overcome the struggles he'd once faced. For the first time in years, Karen felt small. Her assumptions, her quick judgments, her unwillingness to listen. It all felt so petty in the face of the work he was doing. She closed the laptop, her stomach twisting. What now? Karen didn't know why, but she grabbed her phone again and searched for a nearby store. Half an hour later, she was standing in front of a rack of cocktail dresses, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know why she cared. But somehow, she knew she had to be there. The grand ballroom of the Miami Beach Convention Center glittered with elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the polished marble floors, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air as servers weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Veterans, local philanthropists, and community leaders mingled, dressed to the nines. David Harris stood near the stage, exchanging pleasantries with a fellow veteran. His gray suit and dark tie gave him a polished look, but his easy demeanor set him apart from the more formal guests. The weight of organizing the event had worn on him, but seeing the turnout made it worth it. He glanced at his watch. The gala had just begun, and soon he'd be giving his speech. A fundraiser like this could make or break the Foundation's plans for the coming year, and he needed it to succeed. As he turned back to his conversation, his attention was drawn to the entrance. A woman had just walked in, her figure framed in the tall double doors. It was Karen. David blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She wore a simple but elegant black cocktail dress that hugged her frame and stopped just above her knees. Her hair was styled neatly, and she carried a clutch in one hand, her expression a mix of determination and nervousness. "Excuse me," David said to his companion, stepping away. Karen spotted him almost immediately, her eyes locking with his across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she squared her shoulders and walked toward him. "You clean up nicely," David said, his voice light but filled with genuine surprise. Karen rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "Don't get used to it," David chuckled. "What are you doing here, Karen?" Karen hesitated, shifting on her heels. "I looked up your foundation. I read about the work you do. It's impressive." She paused, her voice softening. "I wanted to see it for myself." David studied her, his expression unreadable. "That's a long way from refusing to sit next to me on a plane." Karen winced. "Yeah, well, I'm not proud of that." David tilted his head, waiting. She took a deep breath. "Look, I've spent a lot of time judging people, putting them in boxes because it's easier than actually listening. But you made me realize how wrong I was. I wanted to come here and support what you're doing, to show you that I'm trying to be better." David's face softened, and a small smile appeared. "I appreciate that." Karen glanced around the room, taking in the crowd and the displays highlighting the Foundation's work. "This is amazing, David. You've done something really special here." "Thanks," he said quietly. "It's been a long road, but it's worth it." Karen hesitated, her voice faltering. "I also brought a check." She opened her clutch and handed him an envelope. David raised an eyebrow. "A check?" "It's not much," she admitted quickly, "but I wanted to contribute, to show I believe in what you're doing." David opened the envelope and glanced at the amount. It wasn't extravagant, but it wasn't insignificant either. He looked back at Karen, his expression warm. "Thank you. It means a lot." Karen shrugged, trying to play off her embarrassment. "Don't mention it." Just then, a voice called out over the microphone, announcing that the program was about to begin. David glanced at the stage, then back at Karen. "Stay for the speech?" he asked, Karen nodded. I'd like that. The room quieted as David took the stage. Karen watched from her table, feeling a mix of pride and admiration she hadn't expected. David's voice carried easily over the crowd. He spoke with conviction, sharing stories of veterans who had found new purpose through the foundation. He highlighted the importance of community and the need to bridge divides to support one another. At one point he paused, looking out at the audience. When I started this foundation, I had one goal: to create a space where everyone felt seen, valued, and supported. We come from different walks of life, different beliefs, and different struggles. But at the end of the day, we all want the same thing: a chance to build a better future. Together, we can make that happen. The room erupted in applause, and Karen found herself clapping harder than she'd intended. After the speech, she approached him as the guests began to disperse. "You were incredible," she said, her voice genuine. "Thanks," David replied, his tone modest. "But it's not about me, it's about them, the people we're helping." Karen nodded. Still, it was inspiring. David gave her a thoughtful look. "You know, Karen, coming here tonight, doing something outside your comfort zone, it says a lot about you." She felt her cheeks warm. "I guess I had some learning to do." David smiled. "We all do." Karen hesitated, then extended her hand. "Friends?" David looked at her outstretched hand, then took it in his own. "Friends." As she left the gala that night, Karen felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't just angry at the world. She felt hopeful. 2 months passed after the gala, but the memory of that night stayed with Karen. She had kept in touch with David sparingly, mostly polite texts or occasional check-ins about his foundation. Their newfound friendship felt fragile, uncharted territory for someone who had spent so much time building walls. One rainy December morning, Karen sat in her office at the marketing firm where she worked. She sipped her coffee, scrolling absent-mindedly through her emails. A subject line caught her eye: "The Harris Foundation. Urgent assistance needed." Her heart skipped a beat. She opened the email, which had been sent to all of the foundation's donors. "Dear friends and supporters, we are reaching out today because the Harris Foundation has encountered an unexpected legal and financial challenge. Due to a zoning dispute involving one of our main properties, our transitional housing program for veterans is at risk of shutting down. We are working tirelessly to resolve this issue, but we need your help. If you are able to contribute or know of resources that could assist us, please contact us at the number below. Together, we can ensure that no veteran is left without the support they deserve." Karen stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She immediately picked up her phone and dialed the number listed in the email. "Hello?" David's voice came through, calm but strained. "It's Karen," she said quickly. "I just saw the email. What's going on?" David sighed. "It's complicated. The city flagged one of our transitional housing properties for zoning violations. They're claiming we don't meet certain requirements for mixed-use zoning, even though we've operated there for years without issue. If we can't fix it or pay the fines, they're going to shut us down." Karen frowned. "That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. Do you have a lawyer?" "We do," David said. "But the legal fees are piling up, and the city's dragging their feet. We've raised some funds, but it's not enough to cover everything." Karen hesitated. She wasn't wealthy, but she had connections, people in her industry who owed her favors, and for the first time, she felt a genuine urge to leverage them for someone else. "I might know someone who can help," Karen said, her mind racing. "A friend of mine works for a PR firm that specializes in non-profit advocacy. They've dealt with stuff like this before. Let me call them." David paused. "Karen, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "This is too important." David's voice softened. "Thank you. It means a lot." Karen spent the next few days making calls, pulling strings, and arranging meetings. She connected David with her friend, Amanda, who had years of experience navigating public relations crises. Together, they brainstormed ways to shine a spotlight on the Foundation's plight, while pressuring the city to resolve the issue. A week later, Karen found herself standing outside the Harris Foundation's main office, waiting for David. The office was modest but welcoming, with a large banner that read, "No Veteran Left Behind." David emerged from the building, his expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "Karen," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Thanks for coming." Karen shook his hand. "Of course. How's it going?" "Better thanks to you," David said. "Amanda's been incredible. She's helped us organize a press conference to draw attention to the zoning issue. We've already gotten local media interested." "That's great," Karen said, smiling. David studied her for a moment. "You didn't have to go this far, you know. Most people would have just sent a donation and moved on." Karen shrugged, trying to downplay her efforts. "Well, most people don't owe you for teaching them a lesson in humility." David chuckled, his tension easing slightly. "Fair enough, but still, I appreciate it." Before Karen could respond, a group of veterans emerged from the building, their faces lined with worry. One of them, an older man with a cane, approached David. "David," the man said, his voice heavy with concern. "What happens if we can't stop this? Where are we supposed to go?" David placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "We're not going to let that happen, James. I promise. We're going to fight this with everything we've got." Karen watched the exchange, her chest tightening. These weren't just names on a list or faces in a brochure. They were people. People who had given everything for their country and were now fighting just to have a place to live. As the man walked away, David turned back to Karen. "This is why we can't lose," he said quietly. Karen nodded. "We won't." The next day, the press conference took place on the steps of Miami City Hall. A group of veterans stood behind David as he addressed the crowd, flanked by Karen and Amanda. David's voice was strong and steady as he spoke. "This isn't just about a zoning issue. It's about the promises we make to those who've served our country. These men and women sacrifice so much, and now they're being told they don't belong. That's not right. We're here to say, enough is enough." The media snapped photos and took notes, while Karen stood in the background, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. After the event, David approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't have to be here," he said. Karen shrugged. "Yes, I did." David smiled. "You've changed, you know. The Karen I met on that plane wouldn't have done any of this." Karen looked away, embarrassed but pleased. "I guess some people are worth stepping out of your comfort zone for." David chuckled. "Glad I made the cut." The Foundation's story gained traction in the local news, and public pressure forced the city to reevaluate the zoning issue. Within weeks, the Foundation received the approvals it needed to continue operating, and the fines were significantly reduced. When Karen got the news, she called David immediately. "They caved!" she exclaimed. "You did it!" "No," David replied. "We did it." Karen smiled, the warmth in his voice filling her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The success of saving the Harris Foundation's transitional housing brought Karen and David closer than either of them had expected. Over the following months, they stayed in touch regularly, through text messages, occasional phone calls, and even the occasional coffee when David was in Karen's city for meetings. Karen had begun to see the world differently, questioning long-held assumptions she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. David had become more than a friend. He was a mentor of sorts, someone who challenged her worldview without judgment. But as life often does, it threw them both a curveball. It started with a social media post. Karen was sitting at her kitchen table one evening, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through her Instagram feed. A notification popped up, a tag from her friend Jess. Karen clicked it, her brows knitting together. It was a screenshot of an article, her name highlighted in the text. Local marketer Karen Thompson attends gala for controversial veteran supporter. The article wasn't entirely accurate. It framed the Harris Foundation as a divisive organization, heavily politicized because of David's personal beliefs and his infamous red hat. It hinted at Karen's involvement as a sign of her alignment with those beliefs, twisting her intentions and painting her in a controversial light. Her stomach sank. She clicked the comments, which were already filling with vitriol. Wow, didn't think Karen would support something like this. Disappointing. MAGA Karen strikes again. Guess she's fine with racism now. Yikes. Karen's hands trembled as she closed the app. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Jess calling. Karen, what is this? Jess demanded the moment Karen picked up. Karen rubbed her temple. I don't know. Some reporter must have been at the gala. It's completely out of context. Out of context or not, people are freaking out, Jess interrupted. Your name is being dragged through the mud right now. You need to address this. Karen hung up shortly after, feeling a wave of panic. She sat in silence for a few minutes before picking up her phone again, dialing the one person who might understand. David answered on the second ring. Hey, Karen, what's going on? She hesitated, her voice shaky. Have you seen the article? David paused. Yeah, I saw it. Karen's chest tightened. It's bad, David. People are calling me a racist, a sellout. They think I'm some MAGA fanatic because of you. David's voice was calm but serious. I'm sorry this is happening. I know how frustrating it can be when people make assumptions. Karen flinched at the unspoken irony. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I worked so hard to build my reputation, and now it's falling apart because of one night. David sighed. Look, Karen, I've been through this before. If you respond to every attack, it'll only make things worse. The people who know you, really know you, will see the truth. That's easy for you to say, Karen snapped. You've built your life around controversy. You wear it like armor. I can't do that. David was silent for a moment. Is that how you see me? As someone who thrives on controversy? Karen faltered. No, I didn't mean it like that. It's okay, David said, his tone steady but cool. I get it. You're in a tough spot. But you're also the one who chose to get involved. Karen felt a pang of guilt. I didn't mean to blame you, David. I'm scared. I know, David said gently, and I'll do whatever I can to help. But you've got to decide if you're willing to stand by what you believe, even when it gets uncomfortable. Karen ended the call, feeling more conflicted than ever. The fallout continued over the next few days. Karen found herself the target of online harassment, her inbox flooded with hateful messages. At work, her boss called her in for a meeting, expressing concern over the negative attention. Karen, I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, her boss said carefully, but this isn't good for our image. We need to figure out how to handle this. Karen felt trapped, torn between defending herself and distancing herself from David to save her career. That evening, as she scrolled through yet another wave of hateful comments, she noticed a new post from the Harris Foundation. It was a video of David addressing the controversy head-on. To those who are questioning Karen Thompson's character, let me be clear. She is one of the most compassionate and open-minded people I've ever met. She didn't come to our gala to endorse anyone's politics. She came because she believed in helping veterans, because she saw the humanity in what we do. If you're judging her for that, then maybe it's time to look at your own assumptions. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The next morning, Karen decided to post her own response. She recorded a video, her heart pounding as she spoke. Hi everyone, I've seen the comments, and I want to address them. A few months ago, I met someone who challenged me to think differently. Someone who showed me the importance of listening instead of judging. That person is David Harris, the founder of the Harris Foundation. I attended his gala because I believe in his work, helping veterans rebuild their lives. It's not about politics for me, it's about doing what's right. If that makes me controversial, so be it. But I'm proud of the friendships I've built and the lessons I've learned along the way. She hit post before she could second-guess herself. The response was mixed, but Karen felt lighter for having spoken her truth. Asandi. A week later, Karen received a call from David. "I saw the video," he said. "You did good." Karen smiled. "I learned from the best." David chuckled. "Well, don't let it go to your head." Karen sighed, her voice soft. "Thank you, David, for standing up for me, for everything." "You'd do the same for me," he said simply. And Karen realized, for the first time in her life, she truly would. Months after the controversy, life had begun to settle for both Karen and David. The Harris Foundation's housing program was thriving, thanks to the influx of support following the press conference and public outcry. Karen, despite initial fears, had not only weathered the storm but emerged stronger. Her video had gained traction, winning over those who respected her courage to stand by her beliefs. One crisp spring evening, Karen found herself sitting in a small coffee shop in Chicago. Across from her sat David, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "It's funny," Karen said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I used to think the worst thing in the world was being misunderstood. But now I realize the worst thing is never trying to understand others." David looked up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's growth." Karen smirked. "Don't get used to me being this humble. It's exhausting." David laughed, the sound warm and full. They had agreed to meet to catch up, but Karen had a different reason for asking him to coffee. Taking a deep breath, she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder, sliding it across the table toward him. "What's this?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen hesitated, then gestured for him to open it. Inside were pages outlining a proposal, one that Karen had spent weeks putting together. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how I can do more, not just as a donor or a supporter, but something real. I want to help you expand the foundation. My company's agreed to sponsor a marketing campaign for you. Pro bono. We'll build awareness, attract donors, and hopefully open doors for more programs." David's expression softened as he flipped through the pages. "Karen, this is incredible. You didn't have to do this." "I know," Karen said, her voice steady. "But I wanted to, because I believe in what you're doing, and because I've learned that actions speak louder than words." David nodded, setting the folder down. "You've come a long way since that flight, Karen." Karen chuckled. "Yeah, well, you weren't exactly what I expected either." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. "Can I ask you something?" Karen said suddenly. David nodded. "Do you ever think about taking that hat off? I mean, permanently?" David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I've thought about it, but the truth is, the hat isn't just about politics for me. It's a reminder of where I've been and the conversations it started. Like this one." Karen nodded, accepting his answer. "Fair enough." "And what about you?" David asked, his tone curious. "Do you ever think about running away from controversy again?" Karen laughed softly. "I used to, but now, I think I'm finally ready to face it head on." David smiled. "Good, because the world needs more people willing to listen and to act." In the months that followed, Karen's campaign for the Harris Foundation launched to widespread acclaim. She poured herself into the work, finding a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Meanwhile, David continued his mission, using the foundation to change lives and foster understanding in a divided world. Their friendship, forged in turbulence and tested by adversity, became a cornerstone in both their lives, a reminder that growth often begins in the most unexpected places. And though they came from different worlds, Karen and David had proven that even the most unlikely connections could change the world, one step at a time.